I want to start by thanking each of you for joining us today in this chilly Monday. This is the very last YJI Lunch and Learn webinar of 2020. If this is your first time joining us, welcome. If you've been with us before, welcome back. We'll be back in 2021 with an equally stellar lineup of presenters, so stay tuned. I want to also thank our partners at the New York State Division of Criminal Justice Services, the New York State Office of Children and Family Services, the University at Albany, and the New York State Juvenile Justice Advisory Group for all of their support. It is my absolute pleasure to host Dr. Tim McCuddy today for what promises to be a richly informative conversation and timely. It is wonderful to have you, Tim. To get us going here, I'll pass on the baton to Brian Rainey, who's one of our amazing research assistants at the YJI. And meanwhile, feel free to introduce yourself and say hello to the others in the audience in the chat box. Take it away, Brian.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Youth Justice Institute Lunch and Learn webinar series. As Dr. Lopez said, my name is Brian Rainey, and I'm a graduate research assistant with the YJI. So I do have one housekeeping item. In the calendar invitation email that was sent out Friday and this morning, we included a link to a web page showing how to access all of the features used today. So please reference this resource if you're having issues with these features. We highly encourage you to submit your questions as they come up. There will be points throughout the presentation today that are designated for answering audience questions, and we'll have a Q&A portion at the end. We ask that you put all of your questions for Dr. McCuddy into the Q&A section, and comments can be submitted in the chat. And now that the housekeeping is done, I think that we're ready to hear from an expert in online peers, delinquency, and youth violence. Dr. Timothy McCuddy is an assistant professor in the Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice at the University of Memphis. He previously worked as the project director of the University of Missouri St. Louis Comprehensive School Safety Initiative, which was a longitudinal study on the causes and consequences of school violence. Dr. McCuddy's research focuses on how technology affects social processes related to crime, with an emphasis on peer group dynamics and delinquency. His recent work on peer influence has been featured in the Journal of Research on Crime and Delinquency and in Justice Quarterly. So, without further ado, Dr. Tim McCuddy.
Thanks, Ryan. Let me go ahead and get my screen shared with you. All right, you should be able to see that now, I believe. Well, thank you for inviting me here today. I'm especially excited to be here to get the opportunity to talk about a topic that I've spent the past several years exploring. We're going to talk a lot about social media today, but I recognize that all of us have different experiences, different understandings of what social media is. So before we really get started today, Brian, could you go ahead and launch the first poll question? And I'm simply just trying to understand, what kind of social media do you use? So if you could look through that list there and simply select all those that apply, that is all the different types of social media that you use. See, Facebook and YouTube definitely seem to be the top contenders right now. Give everyone just another few seconds to get those answers submitted. Well, interesting. Right now, it looks to be pretty tied between YouTube and Facebook. And I believe, Brian, you can show those results here in just a second to everyone, correct? Okay, great. So yeah, Facebook is indeed the most common used by attendees here today, followed by YouTube, Instagram, and then Twitter. It's a fun conversation. Sometimes people don't consider YouTube a social media. And I'm not going to specifically go into what is a social media and what is not today. Rather, I'm going to talk about just the various things that kids are exposed to. But I think this is important to highlight because this actually corresponds not exactly with the way kids use social media. When you actually look at the data, Pew did a study and they asked these same questions, and it showed that YouTube, Instagram, and Snapchat are the most commonly used among teenagers. Only about 51% of teenagers in 2018 use Facebook, but among a little bit older generations, Facebook is indeed one of the more common types of social media as indicated by this poll. So good. Only about 1% of you aren't familiar with social media. So luckily, everyone here has some familiarity with the broad kind of concepts that I'll be talking about today. You can go ahead and close that poll, Brian. So why should we care about social media? Well, youth today are part of Generation Z, meaning they are what we call digital natives. Now, there's some variation in how we cut off these generations. For example, when we're talking about millennials, we're usually talking about those born between around the year 1980, 1991, excuse me, 1981, and the cutoff is around the end of 96, 1997. This is the way that Pew defines millennials. So post-millennials, also known as Generation Z, are going to be born after the late 1990s. More specifically, we can use the term digital native to refer to those who experience childhood and adolescence through the technological revolution of the 90s into the 2000s. Now, the labels really don't matter for what I'm talking about today. The point being is when we're talking about teenagers in 2020, we're talking about youth who experience a world where online communication is very common, where smartphones and social media are normative, where we almost expect kids to be using these things. In fact, if kids aren't using social media, we sometimes wonder, why? That seems unusual for us nowadays. Now, before I continue, I want to ask one more poll question because I'm curious, how often is everyone online? I'm going to show you the same kind of results for teenagers here in a second. I'm actually going to put it up here on the slide. But Brian, could you go ahead and launch that second poll? And it's simply asking, how often are you online? Now, this is how it was asked to teenagers. You can interpret that being online, checking email, watching YouTube videos, checking the news, what have you. But how often are you online using the internet, using either a cell phone or a computer? Okay, right now we're hovering about 40% say that you're online pretty much almost constantly. But about half of you say you're online about several times a day. It's still kind of fluctuating a bit. Let that go just for another second or so. Okay, I think that'd be good to go ahead and display those results. Okay, you can see here that about 53% of respondents, attendees today, said that they are online several times a day, and about 42% say that you're online almost constantly. Well, that's not too dissimilar from what teenagers report. About 45% reported in 2018 that they are online almost constantly, and about 90% say that they are online at least several times a day. So kids are online, and they're online a lot. And these numbers are actually pre-COVID. And I think it's interesting to highlight that increase between 2014 and 2015, just that 3-year change. There was a lot more kids who reported being online a lot. So yeah, kids spend a lot of time online. And we know from about 100 years of research that peers influence delinquency. Now, I know many of you attended a previous webinar in the series in which you go into a lot of detail about the intersection of peers and delinquency. I'm not going to revisit that in detail today, but rather I want to ask the question, how does this apply to online peers? If peers are one of the strongest correlates of delinquency, which they are, then what's going on among these digital natives, among these kids who spend so much time online where there could be more opportunities to communicate across space and time? Does this affect the way kids are influenced? And then the final point I want to talk about today is the last bullet point in the slide. What is the meaning behind depictions of online violence? Is it an underlying characteristic that a child's going to be violent? Or is it something else? Could it perhaps be an avoidance behavior? I think, and my experience has taught me that the criminal justice system has often used depictions of violence, for example, a kid holding a gun and hanging out with suspected gang members as an indicator that child is violent, or in this example, that he or she is a gang member. And I'll discuss sometimes youth may do this in a way to avoid violence by maintaining their reputation online so they don't have to be violent in the street. Now, before I kind of continue down this journey and talk about some more background here in my research findings, I just want to be honest with you. I thought this was going to be pretty simple, looking at online peers. We just look at online peers, which would matter because kids spend a lot of time online, and just see what they're exposed to, right? Seems simple enough. It's not that easy. One of the first things I think we all need to do before we can kind of continue talking about online influence is we need to figure out who are online peers. What are we talking about? And this is how I've come to view the structure of online peer groups. So what I have on this slide here shows offline spaces like the school, the neighborhood, and social groups. These social groups could be sports teams, religious groups, other kind of special interest or hobby type groups, groups that revolve around the same general interest, and kids are about roughly the same age. And this is kind of, historically how we would view peer groups. Now, this bottom part here shows us how online spaces, this cyberspace, cyber context, the internet, and social media, how all of this relates to us developing these online peers. But this space is very different. There's no geographic area. Communication is not contingent. It's not necessary. It hinges on opportunity. You have to be, face-to-face at the same time to communicate. So it doesn't have to be live. Kids from different backgrounds and different ages can communicate because you're not relying, again, on physical space to connect. Now, cyberspace makes this a little tricky here because it, on one hand, can create a separate online peer group of individuals who you don't know offline. Now, this is what I'm trying to capture in the red part of this Venn diagram, these overlapping circles at the bottom. This is a unique, kind of distinct online group that exists completely independent of a child's school and neighborhood. And the early research looking at peer influence, looking at online peers in the context of hacking, identity theft, other types of cybercrime, normally took this kind of approach because that's the way online groups looked. But among youth today, most of offline friends use social media, and they're also online friends. And this is captured by the overlap, kind of the purple color here. So the study of online influence is two stories. What is the effect of those new online peers, that red group at the bottom? And what is the effect of how cyberspace influences how we communicate with one another? Does the internet change how we're communicating with the friends we hang out with in the school and the neighborhood? Now, as a researcher, this makes a lot of sense to me. Separate and overlapping groups, let's look at the influence in each context, and then bam, we understand online influence, right? The reality is kids don't really think of their peers like this. This figure that I show you is really the product of someone like me who grew up with an offline only group who started to use social media and formed an online group, and they suddenly kind of became one over time. And this is because I, like most of you, am a digital immigrant. My world started off offline. I started to use the internet, and again, spaces slowly kind of converged into one. So someone like me, and pretty much anyone born before the 1980s or perhaps before the early 1990s, this is what we've been doing. We had an offline space that is continually being merged into the online sphere. But that doesn't really describe kids today. They don't draw as clear of a distinction when thinking about their offline and online friends, not necessarily. They can, but it just becomes a little more muddled when you are immersed in this type of structure from childhood. For many youth, it's just a story of which friend is more active in which space. So they're navigating kind of two social spaces that are separate and they overlap, but it's not really easy to kind of perceive or comprehend. And I know from experience, it's damn sure not easy to ask in a survey. I'm going to come back to that and some of my difficulties that I've faced with that. Now, this is going to be the last kind of theoretical thing I want to discuss today, but I think it's important, and I can elaborate in more detail if anyone has questions, because we need to reframe online influence along two platforms, two ways of thinking. One, internet is a source of peers. It's a context. Second, it influences how we're communicating with our friends more broadly, with our face-to-face friends, online friends, what have you. So the first one, it's a context. A source of peers who can change our attitudes, who can provide new attitudes, can provide reinforcement, can provide group pressure that can affect our behavior. So just like the school has a group of peers, your neighborhood has a group of peers, the internet, cyberspace can be seen as a group of peers. But the second one, second point on the slide, cyberspace is also a mechanism of socialization. It influences how offline friends communicate. We're exposed to our offline friends more often over long periods of time. It can also influence what we say and how we say it. Research continues to show that kids can be disinhibited when online, when they say things online that may not be said offline. Now, part of this is simply being behind a screen, But other factors such as de-individuation and how there's this perception of a large peer group online makes it a little more difficult for kids to feel personally responsible for their behaviors. So they might be a little more aggressive in their messages when using a computer or using a smartphone. So the internet can alter or affect the content of communication between friends. So we have it as a context and as a mechanism that changes what we're saying due to disinhibition and some other factors. Now, this is why it becomes important, I think, especially for criminologists, because smartphones have narrowed the digital divide where the lower class now has access there's less differentiation among social classes and our access to technology. There are still differences in how upper and lower classes access desktops and laptops, but smartphones have narrowed this gap, where youth who reside in households where the income is below 30,000 are just as likely to access the internet as those who live in households that make above 70,000. So it's been narrowed quite a bit. But the digital divide the digital edge is observed in many communities. And this is a concept developed by S. Craig Watkins and his colleagues in a book of theirs, where they did an ethnography of 300 youth in Austin, Texas. And they observed in many communities where Black and Latino youth are more likely to use social media than white youth, but the way they interact online reflects lived experiences with inequality and lack of opportunity. As a criminologist, this was concerning to me, given that my work has examined issues related to using social media as a way to influence behavior. And it raises this question, should violent content be an indicator of violence, an indicator of criminality, of someone's underlying possibility of engaging in violence? And I mentioned these two pieces of work now, and I'm going to end my presentation kind of coming back to them. And there's a book and an article, The Digital Street and the Code of the Tweet, that explain in detail how online depictions of violence have multiple meanings. So again, I'll come back to this, but the idea is that kids portray themselves online as appearing tough, as appearing ready for violence, but this could be to avoid being violent in the street. So now I'm going to show you some research findings of my past and ongoing research, and I'll mention some of the issues that I had with that, and then I'll conclude drawing on work of others and again, kind of elaborating on these multiple meanings behind depictions of violence online. So I collected data on online peer influence initially from undergraduate students as part of my master's thesis, and then my doctoral dissertation explored this in more detail, where I collected data from middle school students who participated in a study on school safety. The online component was a very small part of this larger project, but since then I have collected multiple waves of data as part of this ongoing research. I'm going to share, again, some past findings and ongoing research with you today. So the data for the study come from the UMSL Comprehensive School Safety Initiative. This is a longitudinal study on the causes and consequences of school violence. This took place in St. Louis County. We obtained consent from 3,663 7th and 8th grade students. They were in 12 middle schools across 6 school districts, and we originally collected data in 2017. You can see I have the demographics on the slide. About 47% were male, about 38% were white, 42% Black, and it was split pretty evenly between 7th and 8th grade. And for the purposes of what I'm discussing today, I'm focusing on on respondents with online friends who are not regularly seen in person. At one point in time, I wanted to try to measure everything I've just told you. I wanted to look at online influence. I wanted to look at offline influence. I wanted to see how your offline friends are talking about things online. It was really difficult to try to put this in a survey, and even more difficult to do this in a way in which middle school students could understand what it was that I was asking. So we decided that we were more confident in asking questions related to online friends who are not regularly seen in person. So that's what we focused on this. That's what we focused on for this study. We were looking more at the idea of this being a context, because that's what we could look at in a large survey. Again, looking at a lot of youth. Again, this is just how our survey was structured, our sample was structured. We had about 4,700 kids originally in those schools. Waves 1, we were able to survey 3,640, which is about 99% of those with consent. And then the bulk of what I'll talk about today is focusing on Wave 2 in 2018. And this is because respondents were split evenly between middle school and high school. They were in 33 middle and high schools at that wave, and we had just over 3,000 respondents. So this is what I found when I asked them about their exposure to peer delinquency. And this is looking at that Wave 2 when they're in 8th and 9th grade. This captures the overlap of two things, and I'll walk you through this. I know it might be a little overwhelming. First, in blue are the offline peers. In our survey, we asked a question, have you had any friends who have done the following? And we have items related to any delinquency, violence, theft, and substance use. Green is online support for delinquency. We asked our respondents, were they exposed to online messages in support of the following? Now, the first column here focuses specifically on any delinquency. So I'm grouping together violence, theft, and substance use. We can see there 63% have exposure either online or offline, and that's indicated at the very top part of that graph. 5% are only exposed online, which is the green part. And then 17% are exposed only offline, the blue part, and 41% are exposed in both contexts. A lot to take in, I know. Main thing to note here in this column and across all the behaviors is that that green part, that degree that's online only, is pretty small. Most kids who are exposed online are also exposed offline. That's the red bars there. Red bars are overlap. Kids are exposed in both contexts. So when I first started this, I honestly thought the green bars would be a little more substantial. I thought there'd be a little more kind of unique online exposure, but that's not what I found. Violence is the second column. It's a little less prevalent, same overall kind of pattern, but the kind of unique online exposure to violence is the least common. So if kids are exposed to violence, they're most likely going to be exposed in person, not only online. If they're exposed online, they're also exposed in person. Substance use is probably the most unique behavior here. That's because that degree of online only exposure, that green bar, is a little more, there's more respondents there. About 8% of respondents who are exposed to substance using peers are only exposed online. But just by looking at it, you can see about 2/3 of kids who have friends who use drugs are also going to be exposed to online peer support for drug use. So again, to summarize the whole slide, little unique online exposure. Online exposure is a little more common for substance use, where that unique exposure takes place. But by and large, unique online exposure is not near as prevalent as I expected. Now, I'm not going to show you any fancy tables with regression models, and instead I'm just summarizing prior research that I've done. There's mixed evidence when we're trying to look at the association between online peers and self-reported crime. When I'm looking at delinquency and violence, there's mixed evidence. There's different ways we can measure these variables, and I'm happy to go into more detail about what I did here for those who are interested. But basically, if you're exposed to online peers who do these behaviors, or if you're exposed to a variety of different behaviors, it's really not related to your self-reported delinquency or violence. There were some models where changes in peer exposure to peers was related to changes in these outcomes. I don't want to get into the statistics about it. Basically, we just have less confidence that there's an actual association there. For causality, we have to have temporal ordering. We just need to know the exposure to peers took place before engaging in the type of delinquency. So I can't disentangle that in these models. I just don't have enough waves. So there's just mixed evidence is the best I can say when we're looking at general delinquency or violence. When we're looking at theft and substance use, I find more evidence. Across different ways of measuring those variables, I find that exposure to online peers is indeed associated with engaging in those same offline behaviors. Again, talking about theft and substance use. However, what I really want to stress is that across all my models, offline peers remain the strongest source of influence. In fact, I see strong online effects until I control for offline peers. So what that means is studies that are only looking at online influence, that don't look at what's happening with friends in schools and neighborhoods, it's going to overestimate the effect of online influence. Because what kids are exposed to online, they're also being exposed to offline. So this really, I think, demonstrates we have to be looking both at the internet and what's going on in person to understand how kids are influenced by their peers. We also need to have data over time, because cross-sectional research, when we're only looking at one point in time, tend to show pretty strong online effects, but there's less effects or less support when you look at these associations over time. Again, we only have 3 waves of data that I was able to look at this. Ideally, I'd have a little bit more and could do some more sophisticated models. But pretty much any way I've looked at this, the substance use findings are the most robust, where there's the strongest effect appears matters for drug use, not so much for violence. But it's really important that I want to stress one more time here. What I'm looking at is exposure to online peers who are not regularly seen in person. All this online influence I'm capturing are not going to be the friends hanging out in school or in the neighborhood. This is the unique online friends. So I'm looking at, exposure of things like exposure to violence, substance use, and theft among this kind of unique peer group. But what I find is they're not really influencing kids' behavior all that much. We still need more data on online influence from offline friends. Now, as one final finding I want to share with you, kind of related to this research question, is to get at this issue that I have. I want to look at all kids, and I want to understand, are kids willing to even talk about these types of behavior online? I took it as a bit of an assumption that kids were willing to talk about illegal behaviors. And that's because there's a lot of literature showing that kids post violent things online. They post substance use or they post their drug use and that sort of thing. So at wave 2 in our survey, we added a question trying to capture disinhibition. And we asked respondents, if you did something illegal and wanted to talk to somebody about it, would you do it online or in person? And then we provided a 7-point scale in which they could indicate if they prefer online or they prefer talking in person. Some people hate figures, so I'm going to summarize this in text on the right. So same overall kind of set of findings. Most youth, about 66%, prefer talking in person about their delinquency. And about 9% prefer talking online. So again, if a kid did something illegal and they want to talk to friends about it, about 9% would prefer talking online. About a quarter of respondents, 25%, said they don't care. There's really no preference. So we could take this to mean that about a third of youth, 34% of my respondents, are willing to talk online. Either they prefer talking online about their delinquency, or they have no preference. They're just as likely to talk online or in person. About a third of youth. But just under half of youth, 44%, will only talk in person about their delinquency. 44% will not talk at all online about their involvement in illegal behaviors. And then about 4% are only going to talk online. They are so deterred from talking in person that the online context, social media, is the only way in which they will discuss these behaviors with their friends. I think it's always great and fascinating when you have one question that can give you such rich information that we have here. Key takeaway is that kids are still preferring offline communication, and that is where most of the delinquent peer influence mechanisms take place. I'm doing some additional work looking at factors associated with these preferences. I have some preliminary results that males and those who are impulsive prefer online disclosure. But I think what's really interesting, what I'm finding, is that violent attitudes, kids who have violent attitudes prefer to disclose offline. But they are also more likely to have pro-social attitudes. So things like being committed to school, things like having high degrees of parental attachment are associated with preferring offline disclosure. But also I found variables like violent attitudes that emphasize toughness and violent responses when disrespected. Those are also associated with offline disclosure. So both mechanisms of social control and antisocial values are associated with offline disclosure. But the important thing, and what I was trying to uncover, is what's associated with online disclosure. And there's really not much. Again, gender and impulsivity was what I found to be associated. Now, I want to, well, just to back up a bit, most of my work has taken a social learning approach. I'm looking at how peers socialize their friends into delinquency. As I read more and more about the criminal justice system, the way that it uses social media evidence, I realized that I had an issue with my approach, and I want to share this with you so we can all learn from this. I assumed my respondents could interpret content in support of violence, that they knew if they saw something violent online, that was in support of violence, if that was reinforcing violence or if it was against violence. I thought kids could pick up on that. And then I realized that no one can pick up on it as easy as I thought. And if I can try to summarize our current state of where we're at with this line of research with cyberspace and violence, I think there's 3 possibilities. The first is that cyberspace can escalate offline violence. I did not find much evidence of this in my previous study on youth in St. Louis, but on the next slide, I'm going to show you a few findings from research looking at the intersection of gang-involved youth and social media. And you will see there is indeed some evidence this takes place. But perhaps I would argue its perceived frequency is a bit exaggerated. Or perhaps this is more common among violent youth, but it doesn't increase the prevalence of violence among youth in general. But maybe those who are already violent, maybe the internet can exacerbate or can enhance some processes. The second possibility is that cyberspace can reflect violence as it exists offline. This might be the least surprising finding. Kids have a tendency to record fights and physical altercations, which can then be uploaded to social media. So sometimes social media is literally reflecting what's happening offline. But again, I think the most surprising one that I will elaborate on in a second is that it can be used to de-escalate and avoid violence. But first, just to touch on some of the gang research that's out there, there is evidence to suggest that social media extends social processes by generating conflict and intensifying existing tension. And I provide some citations here since what I'm discussing on this slide is not my own work, and I can provide references for those who want to look this up and get more information. But yes, it can be used to generate conflict and intensify tension. Desmond Patton has coined this term back in 2013 called cyber banging or internet banging, and it's used to refer to how gang banging has moved online. More specifically, how the internet and social media can be used to promote one's gang membership and just promote participation in violence. But additional work has found that the internet is used primarily for self-promotion and for general communication among gang members, that the diffusion of gang culture is the most significant contribution of social media. Not a lot of evidence that gangs recruit online. It's more for self-promotion. And there's more evidence that the existing gang culture could be spread online, not as a mechanism to increase membership per se. And a lot of research has found that gang members are a little more active on cyberspace. They're more likely to prefer making friends online. They spend more time online, and they spend more time specifically communicating with friends online. And this got me thinking, if the online context matters as much, if not more, for gang-involved youth or for violent youth, would online influence be stronger among these youth? Would this association between online peers and violence be stronger for gang-involved youth? So Finnes Benson and I did some work looking at the data from St. Louis. And what I'm showing here just captures some descriptive findings. We analyzed gang versus non-gang youth in our sample. During our first wave, we had about 314 youth who were coded as gang involved based off some self-reported items. And again, I can go into more measurement issues here if anyone has questions. But we had 314 youth that we identified as gang involved. So I looked at a question that I haven't really talked a lot about today, but it was an item trying to get at how respondents or how kids are first exposed to delinquency. Are they first exposed in person or online? And what we found was that about half of gang members report first learning about their friends' illegal activities online rather than in person. Now, I don't know if this is capturing, is this where kids are going to learn something online and not talk about it in person? We don't know that. All this is capturing opportunity, that they are first learning online as opposed to learning about it in person. So that happens with about half of gang members versus about 1/5, about 22% of non-gang members. And then finally, I asked that same question about disinhibition that I just showed you a figure a few slides ago. If gang members did something illegal and they wanted to talk to their friends about it, they are more likely to prefer talking online compared to non-gang members. It's about 16% preferred disclosing online compared to offline. It's a small difference. It is significant, but yeah, there was that difference among gang members. And I just want to direct you, if you're interested to learn a bit more about this research or just more about gangs and social media more broadly, Chris Meldy and Frank Veerman have an edited volume that just came out this year called Gangs in the Era of Internet and Social Media that has a chapter with these results that I just talked about. Our main conclusions were that gang-involved youth do appear slightly more active in cyberspace, again, drawing from some of those findings that I shared with you. But in more sophisticated models, we tried to look at that association between online peers and offline violence, and we find that online peers don't have much additional influence on gang-involved youth. And then finally, I just want to conclude with this discussion of the many meanings of social media. The Digital Street, it's a book written by Jeffrey Lane, discusses how the publicity and respect obtained from disclosing participation in street violence can outweigh perceived consequences. This was something I got a lot of push back from senior criminologists when I started doing this line of work. Do kids really post this stuff online? Why would a kid post their drug use online? Why would a kid post a picture of them holding a gun? Those familiar with Elijah Anderson's Code of the Street know that kids in poor urban areas may project toughness, may engage in violent posturing, may simply resort to violence as a response to the ever-present threat of violence in their community. Those who are committed to a Code of the Street feel compelled to risk their life if disrespected. And we know from research that factors like poverty, lack of opportunity, and social isolation can give rise to these adaptations that emphasize respect, that emphasize defending one's honor. And what this book talks about is that the internet can extend all of this by providing a public space to demonstrate toughness, which is really important to keep in mind what I mentioned several slides ago about the digital edge. Lower class and minority youth may experience social media differently, and their online interactions can reflect lived experiences with inequality and lack of opportunity. And perhaps something I should have actually put on this slide, we may observe elevated levels of online violence among certain populations due to exposure to offline violence. And that's because this could be used as an avoidance technique. Forrest Stewart, in his article, The Code of the Tweet, talks about how cyberspace can be used to avoid violence. I'm going to skip over the defend and repair reputations now just for the sake of time, and it's not as related to what I'm talking about. But the second one talks about creating that tough online image and the reliance on physical violence. If a kid can post a picture of a gun and convince everyone that he's armed and he's willing to use it, maybe he can avoid being harassed. Maybe he can avoid being bullied. Maybe he can make it home safely. Maybe people won't mess with him. There have been cases where youth have borrowed a gun from a friend, taken multiple pictures wearing different shirts across a few minutes, and then upload one picture per day on social media to give the perception that they're armed, that they have that gun, that they're violent. In reality, that gun could be borrowed and possessed only for a few minutes. This is an example I've seen throughout others' research, and my wife, who's a public defender, has shared several exampds of where this has happened with her clients who don't own a gun, but there is social media evidence of them holding a gun. In reality, it was borrowed. And it's because of some of these processes that we may risk overstating the violent effects of social media. While some of us, perhaps most of us, may view that teenager who uploads a post, displaying a gun as an indicator of violence, they might be doing that so they don't have to be violent in the street. This is going to be more common in distressed areas, plagued with poverty and crime. So we run the risk of over-policing communities that already face problems. So we need to be careful. I think we should not look at social media evidence in isolation and instead use it in conjunction with other evidence. So just to wrap up kind of where we're at with all of this, I think we still have a lot to learn about online influence. I think it requires interdisciplinary mixed methods research. A lot of the work, especially on gangs, has been qualitative, which is really good and useful, but I think we also need some quantitative research to better able to address whether or not violence is actually increasing or decreasing. Even when it comes to things like bullying and cyberbullying, which has been studying now for a couple of decades, we still really struggle with defining our variables. The online peer or the peer research in general faces a lot of problems with measuring items, and that's a whole separate issue that I could get into. But we have a lot of work to do with our methods here. I do think the fear of online influence may be greater than the risk, but it's still unclear how social media influences communication among your in-person or offline groups. We need to better understand this process. Now, with the pandemic, this takes a more interesting twist, and I'm sure I'll get asked some questions about the pandemic. Kids obviously spend more time with their face-to-face friends now online. Everything I've talked about today has been pre-pandemic. But given what we know about online disinhibition, it remains to be seen how online socialization among youth over the past year has affected their attitudes, has affected their reinforcement toward violence. And I don't have any clear answers, but I'm happy to kind of elaborate and speculate based off my experience. And maybe you might have some suggestions as well that we can kind of start to entertain. But the big question, does the internet escalate, reflect, or de-escalate violence? Yes, that's my answer, yes. All three are plausible, it depends. But what does it depend on? I think a fair takeaway from my research and others is that yes, online conflict can and does lead to offline violence. It is just not the norm among most kids and does not appear to increase the overall prevalence of violence. Now, among the most violent youth, among the gang members, we do see some evidence that yes, social media does facilitate violence. And kids now are online in ways they hadn't been before. And I think this does just open up a lot of questions. We're in a virtual webinar. Many of us may not have used Zoom or online video chat a year ago. And now we're all kind of, using more technology in ways that we haven't before. And, I think it's important as this becomes more, common and more normative that we keep in mind that I think a lot of this risk that's been suggested in the past for, about online peers has been exaggerated. And it doesn't mean that we need to not be concerned with online violence or these things I'm talking about. In fact, since we know it does occur and it does take place, maybe we should use this as evidence. We need to do better about developing interventions to disrupt the link between online conflict and offline violence. And there's been some programs that do this, especially among gang members. And there's been some programs in Chicago where outreach workers will use social media to try to diffuse conflicts. So I think that's still fair that, that still takes place where the internet generates conflict. But I think that at this point, one of the best kind of recommendations that I can give is we want to help kids navigate a digital world. And that's going to be essential for helping us keep our youth safe. Let's face it, kids, learning to avoid things like phishing schemes and identity theft is going to be just as important as balancing a checkbook of decades ago. Hopefully that example still is relevant. Kids need to know how to avoid online victimization, how to interpret content they are exposed to. Resiliency may very well be part of that equation, but there are various skills kids can be taught. Simple things like reporting, when bullying takes place is just one example. We can have a whole separate conversation about the need to make sure kids can understand what's credible and trustworthy. I teach research methods, and one of my goals in that class is to help students understand what's credible. When it comes to peers, when it comes to kids trust their friends. They're influenced by their friends. The research shows, again, luckily there's little new risk, but I think we're going to need to, pay attention to how online processes enhance peer influence beyond what takes place in school or one's neighborhood. If we weren't concerned a year ago, I think, in light of kids spending more time online, perhaps we should pay a little more attention to see what's going on. And with that, that's all I have for you today.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tim. And now I think we're going to move into just a few questions for me, the conversation portion.
Sure.
These primarily have to do with what you were anticipating, Tim, COVID.
Of course.
In the current moment, yes. So how might the current moment, the time of social distancing and greater online socialization, impact youth, particularly as it relates to youth violence?
Yeah, my research and others show, pre-pandemic, kids are online, to some degree. And, I think this is overall what kind of led to us initially overestimating the risk provided by social media. Kids are on there, they're seeing bad things. It makes sense. Yes, kids are online a lot, but what my research shows is that they're not really preferring online communication in a way that I think many parents might think. That they're still preferring to discuss the bad things in person, so to speak. So what I think we might see moving forward is those mechanisms like disinhibition, which leads to self-disclosure, might increase among those who prefer offline communication. Perhaps a lot in the past, kids were deterred from talking about their illegal behavior on social media due to the fear of the consequences. Maybe not those kids who adhere to the code of the street like I was talking about, but kids in large, may have been deterred. But if these youth are now, spending more time online, using the internet in ways they haven't done before, then I think that the notion of disinhibition could start affecting those kids a bit more, because those are the kids that previously weren't as inclined to spend a lot of time online, but now when they're forced to, that can change these processes in ways that it's really difficult for us to anticipate. Because if kids, just for example, were to start, disclosing things online a little bit more now, perhaps that could change, what kids think is socially acceptable. And that was one of my goals when I first started this, was about this idea of what is socially acceptable behavior. And does that change because kids are online? When they grow up in a world immersed online, does that change our norms? And so far, I found not that much, because it's a reflection of what they're seeing offline.
Thank you for that. And so how might using online quote unquote tough self-images of youth as evidence of quote unquote criminality create or exacerbate sort of disparities and inequality, particularly as it relates to race, ethnicity, class?
Mm-hmm. This, as I mentioned, this is becoming a kind of an increasing concern of mine as I try to unpack these online effects. And then I realized that, online influence can mean different things to different people. And I think that's something so important for all of us, researchers and practitioners to learn. Kids in bad neighborhoods, impoverished, distressed neighborhoods are going to be the ones most likely to post social media content to front, to project this tough image, to avoid victimization. These communities are already under heightened police attention due to higher crime rates. I imagine most of us are pretty familiar with the association between economic disadvantage and crime. They're strongly related. Poor areas tend to have higher crime rates. So youth who reside in these areas have a number of risk factors related to delinquency. Sometimes this can be referred to as the cradle to prison pipeline, a variation of the school to prison pipeline. But I do a lot of work on schools, and I'll just kind of draw just one parallel if I can. We can think of like zero tolerance policies and how we view something like substance use. But if we kind of like track backwards, we might realize that if we start at the point of origin, that poverty might lead to a lack of healthcare. That could lead to gaps in into childhood development. That could lead to disparities in educational opportunities. It can lead to mental and emotional problems. Maybe that is the domino effect that leads to substance use. And then when we then criminalize substance use, from like a school perspective, perhaps, that's kind of adding in, this extra layer of not necessarily acknowledging kind of that cumulative risk that led to why that child is engaging in that behavior. So if I can, so in that case, we're criminalizing substance use, even though it's the end result of factors beyond the child's control. So I think when we relate this to social media, this cultural adaptation to project toughness when residing in a violent neighborhood, it's a product, again, of being in that violent neighborhood. So if we kind of criminalize the social media content when it's used as a way to avoid violence, then we are exacerbating those disparities. We're making them worse because that's the product of the environment. Whereas before, arguably substance use is bad and kids, shouldn't be using drugs. So it's not quite that same, forgivingness of that thing we're criminalizing. But I think it's this idea that, absent those negative risk factors, that child may not feel compelled to create that tough image. Thus, they would not post that social media content to front. So if we criminalize kids for trying to avoid victimization, this is just simply going to be more likely to happen in distressed communities. And that's my concern, and it relates back to this idea of exacerbating inequality, because those are the communities in which we're going to see higher rates of online violence.
Okay, and I think we're going to move into our audience Q&A portion of this. And the first question we got in was, how might school context prevent online peer influences on delinquency or criminal offending?
That's a good question. And honestly, that's something I can kind of look at in my data too, because I have data on different schools. It boils down to, I think, in terms of what kids are going to be, the overlap. First of all, I don't know, but I can just speculate. I think that, with what I just said, if you're in a distressed community or school and you're exposed to high levels of violence, then that might be associated with also having higher, exposure to online violence. So, it could even be that the overlap may be more prominent in those areas, in certain schools versus others. And I think that might be kind of interesting to look at moving forward. That is how schools that where drug use is more prevalent versus schools that have more of a bullying problem per se, or more interpersonal conflict between students. How is social media exacerbating that? In terms of, again, most of what I look in is regarding influence and about how kids learn behaviors, learn violent norms, and are reinforced to engage in violence. But I think school level factors, because the internet and social media can create tension, it can create conflict. And especially with bullying. And I think I'm going to kind of pivot a bit to that. So I think that's the best example I can give when it comes to schools, is that, the internet can be used as a way to enhance bullying that's going on. And in schools that don't have, improving the culture in schools, I think, is the best way to reduce bullying, improve things like reporting behaviors and that sort of thing. So when the culture is different in schools that may have lower levels of bullying because there's more kind of school commitment, there's more kind of sense of community among the school, I think that could reduce the effect of negative online influence. I have no idea if that same thing would apply to the online peer influence, but I think there is some indication that could occur for cyberbullying. So I would be really interested, and in fact, that is something that I absolutely could explore within my research to see if there are school level differences in the ways that kids can exert their online influence. That's a really good question.
Yeah. So with schools operating largely online due to the pandemic and little opportunity for in-person interactions, how might that impact some of your findings, specifically with self-disclosure? And the second part of this is, would you hazard a hypothesis?
I'll be honest, when I first started this research, I thought the self-disclosure component was going to be much more of a prominent finding, that I would see that a lot of kids were disinhibited online, that, and this is anecdotal just from my own experiences with social media. I found that my online friends were different from what I experienced in person. I found out about a lot of their drug use and about, involvement in all sorts of crimes online that I wasn't seeing in person. So as, again, being a digital immigrant and kind of having my, online world, slowly merge into my offline, I was always so fascinated because, again, it felt like a different culture. It felt like a different set of norms online. And I think I was trying to apply that to my study of digital natives. But again, what I realize is that it's now that the overlap is just so immersed, it's very difficult to kind of disentangle, with what's going on between, the online, offline peer. That on one hand, it was just not as, this whole line of research just wasn't near as clean as I had hoped. So I think it's going to be really difficult, first of all, just to kind of research the disinhibition among those kids, especially how that's going to be associated with their behavior in terms of, encouraging or reinforcing violence. I do think, as I kind of mentioned before, that the possibility of that has been increased because of the pandemic, because kids who normally wouldn't have those stronger preferences or wouldn't prefer to talk online now are forced to. So whereas, that 9% before said they prefer, talking online, but before I found about 34% were willing to talk about their illegal behavior online. Is that going to increase now? I would say probably, to a large degree, to actually affect behavior. That I don't know. So yes, I do. If I had to hypothesize, or if I had to predict, I would say that I think, disinhibition. And see, it's not even so much as that disinhibition. I don't want to use that word. I think online disclosure is going to increase post-pandemic. But again, it remains to be seen if that is going to still just be a reflection of what kids are already exposed to, or is that actually going to change their behavior? And the one thing I didn't talk about today is that, what about the age of the kids? For middle schoolers or elementary age children, that might be a very different thing going on compared to high school kids. Because the high school kids, yes, they're already exposed offline, so that's maybe why there's that redundancy. But among younger kids, I do think that, yeah, there is that possibility they could be exposed online, maybe a little bit earlier than they would have been in the past, because they're spending more time online at a younger age than they would have in years past.
So are you aware of any examples of social media interventions that are successful in lowering violence engagement, or this sort of tough exterior that is posted online?
Yes, I wish I had names in front of me right now. The work of Desmond Patton out at some of his work in Chicago, he's one to look into. He's done a lot of interesting work. Part of that's working with outreach workers. to reduce violence. And what's interesting about some of his work is actually trying to use the software to identify like guns and images of violence when they first happen, so that way outreach workers can then intervene. I think what's going to be so important in terms of outreach workers kind of moving forward, and I think this hopefully is coming across to be pretty clear, is that we can learn a lot by asking the why behind, you know, that kid posting a picture of a gun. If you had a social worker, someone to intervene and find that out ahead of time, and to find out, is that an avoidance mechanism, and then to perhaps educate or instill other skills to avoid victimization instead of fronting and trying to be tough online. I think that is one way that, you know, we can try to intervene before it has the chance to generate conflict. So again, his work out of Chicago, honestly, it's one of the areas that I keep seeing programs come out of, and I think that's just honestly, a lot of the issues that Chicago has with violence more broadly, being a large city, and just the type of work going on there. So right now, I don't have any kind of go-to programs to recommend, more so that I think we really need to try to wrap our heads with how to intervene, because, you know, on one hand, we can apply a lot of the things that we do offline to online. But with what I just discussed with those multiple meanings, that's kind of a new element that I think outreach workers and social workers are going to have to to understand in a little more detail, to figure out, you know, what other skills, what other alternatives can we then give to kids so they don't feel compelled to post this content to avoid their own victimization.
And I think we have time for one more question.
Sure.
So how can schools manage these circumstances or conditions in school when so much is being posted online or occurring off campus? Who can they collaborate with to address the impact of social media posts or incidents that happen in schools?
I think, you know, the school policies differ, obviously, across jurisdictions, but I think one area that we can start to look at is cyberbullying and how the laws and the policies have emerged over time. Because I touched on this a little bit in the podcast that we did earlier this summer. But one issue that's happened in states where I came from, Missouri, and where I'm at now in Tennessee, is that schools have responsibility for bullying that takes place outside of campus. So if a kid is cyberbullied online over the weekend, then the school is then responsible for addressing that. So in the same way, you know, should we, you know, draw a parallel where schools should be responsible for, you know, negative peer influence online? It's a little bit different, because a lot of what I discussed today is kind of the theory behind the social forces behind violence. You know, we can talk about the pandemic in a different context in terms of increasing violence, because there's social forces related to, you know, being cooped up and poverty, unemployment, that are going to increase violence, completely independent of peer influence. This is going to be independent of the social learning, influence reinforcement kind of stuff that I've been talking about. So, yeah, it can kind of appear in different ways, but I think that in terms of the school's intervention, that honestly, you know, right now, I think there's a lot more concern kind of with the bullying in terms of how schools can figure out how to intervene, how to work with local law enforcement to deal with those issues when there's a clear victim and there's a clear aggressor that can be identified, and, you know, there can be an intervention taking place. So it's going to be much, much more difficult. Because when I asking about these questions, it's not, you know, whether or not I have, Brian, if you're posting violent content, it's about how many of my friends online are posting violent content. You know, do about half my friends, a quarter of my friends, some of my friends. It's not worded exactly like that, but the idea is to get a proportion of your friends. So yeah, I can't, within what we're doing, I can't look at Brian and say, hey, you're the bad person, you're my bad influence, let's target you, you should be suspended. It's much more kind of broad than that. But I think, again, schools can kind of look to what's going on with bullying to try to develop perhaps, you know, kind of more interventions to make sure that we're not criminalizing that online content. I think that's going to be really, really important, or at least, you know, make sure we're looking at all the evidence and not only looking at what happens on social media.
Right. So Tim, I'd like to thank you on behalf of the YJI and everyone in attendance today for presenting this work on online peers and youth violence. I think that I can speak for just about everyone here when I say that this has been an incredibly interesting presentation with timely implications, particularly given the current push towards online socializing. But before we leave, I would like to ask if you have any parting words of wisdom for us.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I would have ended, this exact way a few years ago, but I think, what's always fascinated me about the social sciences is how our perceptions, our fears don't always align with the likelihood of experiencing something. And again, I thought that the online violence was, so prominent that I was just going to see all this online negative influence. That's not at all what I saw. And I was reminded, I grew up in kind of a violent area in Memphis, and I always witnessed violence, and I was always really scared about how often that would happen to me. And should I change my behavior because of what I'm seeing? So I think when it comes to social media, again, there's this healthy amount of fear from us, digital immigrants. That makes sense because we didn't have a childhood fully immersed with social media. It's hard for us to understand why kids would post these bad things, about drugs and about guns and that type of thing online. So I think, for us digital immigrants, there really is part of our own education that has to happen here. We really have to figure out, it's not just taking what has worked offline, what's worked for our interventions, what's worked with our social programs, and then applying it to what we see on the internet. It's understanding how the internet is the same and different, and then trying to figure out how to help kids navigate this digital world. That idea of digital citizenship, I think, is so important for kids to develop resiliency and to understand the meanings behind of what they're exposed to and how to avoid continue to being exposed and not be negatively affected by that.
For everyone in the audience, if you're interested in hearing about some of Tim's other work, we also interviewed him for the first episode of our podcast series, Let's Talk About Youth Justice. And Tim and I had a conversation about bullying and cyberbullying, and the link for that can be found on the YJI website. Shortly after we finish here today, we'll be sending a survey to you all via email. If you have the time, please complete the survey, as it allows you to provide further feedback and questions for us. And this information will be used to improve future webinar sessions. The survey should take about no longer than 5 minutes, and Alicia, I believe, will be putting the link to that survey in the chat. And finally, if you've not already done so, feel free to connect with us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. The links to those accounts can be found on our website as well. And just a reminder that the views expressed here are those of the presenter and do not necessarily reflect the views of the New York State Youth Justice Institute. And in closing, I just want to thank you all for taking part in this session of the YJI Lunch and Learn series. We hope that you've gained something from this webinar and that you continue to think about what Tim has presented here today. And we also look forward to seeing you at future YJI events and webinars. So thanks again, everybody, and have a great rest of your week.